Hi and welcome back. This video will be about the 2019 RadMini and a review and an update after using the bike a little over 2,000 miles. I use the bike for daily commuting to and from work. The ride is about 5.5 miles in each direction, and I do ride rain, shine, or snow pretty much every single day. The commute itself takes about 15 to 20 minutes in each direction, depending upon traffic, how many red lights I hit, and how much traffic is on the actual bike path. The actual commute itself is about half on the bike path and half on the streets, and I try to minimize how much I'm riding on the streets just due to traffic and safety reasons. So this video will be an update from going along the way as far as how the bike has been performing, the reliability of it, and just the overall performance as far as how it's handled through the rain and all the daily commuting itself. As far as the bike goes in general, I don't have any major complaints on it. The only thing I really have, and I mentioned this in my original video, is that the components on the bike are definitely entry level, and the weight of the bike, it's pretty heavy. But overall, as far as an entry level electric bike with these kind of specs, as far as a 750 watt motor and a 48 volt battery, pricing wise, it's actually very reasonable for what you get. As far as for overall tire performance on the bike, and this is not going to be listed in a pro and a con because it is relative to riding conditions, is that I have had 3 flat tires on the rear so far. The first one came about 1,200 miles after ownership. I actually ran over some metal. I do remember riding over it and feeling it, and I knew that, more or less after I ran over it, it did puncture the tire. So that was pretty straightforward. The second time I had a flat on the rear, which was just about a couple hundred miles after that, it was very strange. Started riding the bike and then it just lost pressure. But it didn't lose all of the pressure. When I eventually took it back off and aired it back up, the tube itself was holding pressure, but it did let out a little bit overnight, so there must have been a very slow leak somewhere. And the third and final time that I had a flat on the rear so far, I actually ran over a small nail, so I'll show a little picture of that in the video here. A little bit of a finishing nail went through, and just a slow leak, so that was just bad luck. Now I'm going to run down the pros on the bike as far as my opinion after 2,000 miles. The overall wet performance as far as for the electronics, haven't missed a beat. I've ran through a lot of rain, a lot of downpours, a lot of just regular wet weather, and so far no major issues with the bike. It's been running right along, no error messages on the display. It's been doing pretty well. One other thing I'm just going to note as far as like a pro, sometimes some people complain that the fenders on the bike are a little too big. And they definitely look a little big as far as the rear fender and the front fender, but they work very, very well. When going through wet weather or even running through any puddles, I've never had any spray come up on my clothing. The only thing I've ever had happen, which is just a characteristic of running through the water, is my feet have gotten wet. If I'm going through a deep enough puddle, the splash out that goes from the tires themselves can hit your feet while they're on the pedals. As far as for consistency and power, the bike has stayed pretty level as far as power output throughout the mileage. Granted, this is the second replacement wheel on the back, which I'll go through the cons. That was replaced under warranty, so this particular wheel has about 500 miles on it, and it's been performing really well since it's been replaced back in January. Overall range on the bike has been really good. The longest I've ever gotten the bike on a single charge is a smidge over 30 miles. It was about 31 or 32 miles. Went on a pretty decent bike ride. Stayed for the most part in power level 3 the entire way. Went all the way down through Brooklyn and back up to Upper Manhattan where I live, and performed really well. Still had one bar remaining on it when I was coming back home. It did start flashing on the way home, but was able to make it back, and everything performed okay. As far as for the range to and from when I go to work, I do always ride in power level 5, and I normally charge every day while at work. So I'll do one cycle to work and back, so 11 miles on it. Typically I go through 2 bars, sometimes a third bar, depending on the temperature outside, but I'm able to ride in full power to ride at full speed the entire way. I have gone a couple occasions not charging the bike during the day, and I can get 2 full trips back and forth, which is about 22 miles, but again, riding in power level 5 the entire way. At the end, when riding back on the last trip, I am into the last bar of the battery, and it is starting to blink by the time I get to work. And at that point in time, once you get into that last bar, it does start to reduce power so then you aren't able to go as fast. After having 3 flat tires on the rear, was able to kind of get down pretty easy to replace the tube on the rear. It's not that bad once you've done it a couple times. There's just a sequence you have to follow as long as you have basic mechanic ability with a bike. It's just a matter of loosening a couple different bolts in order to get everything apart and then pull the rear wheel out. And now I'm going to run through the cons as far as my personal experience after having the bike for about 2,000 miles. As mentioned, this is the second replacement wheel that's on the bike, so I've gone through, this is the third one in total since the bike was brand new. The first wheel, I had about 60% of the spokes break down by the hub, and then the axle was actually starting to twist on the frame itself, so they ended up sending me a replacement wheel. The second wheel I got, within a week or two after the wheel was on there, I started getting a grinding kind of humming noise from the motor. Went back and forth with Rad a handful of times, had to send them a bunch of videos, and then they did finally agree to send out another wheel. Over that course of time, I've always had VeloFix come out, which is the mobile company that they kind of contract through to keep for warranty procedures, and VeloFix has been great along the way. One thing I mentioned before was the brake performance in my previous videos. The brake performance during dry weather is respectable. It's not the best, but it's pretty decent. As far as wet weather performance, at least with myself personally, I'm about 245 pounds loaded up with my backpack, my rain gear, and everything else, so I'm definitely on the heavier end of the spectrum as far as what the range is on the bike. And in the wet weather, the braking performance, you definitely have to give yourself a little bit more room. And that's really about it. It's just, you have to be a little more careful when you're in the wet weather just to make sure that you have enough stopping distance. My other gripe about the brakes too is that the cable seems to slip a little bit after riding. I typically have to adjust the cable for the brakes every 2 to 3 weeks. In the first step, I'll be able to adjust it from the actual adjustment knobs up on the handle here for the brake lever, and then within a couple more weeks after that. So typically about once every 4 to 6 weeks, I actually have to get down to the caliper, readjust the brake cable back up onto the caliper itself. That way it'll be able to grab a little more. I've been looking to find a solution as far as how to fix this. I really haven't been able to find anything, so at this point in time, I just adjust it once every month and a half. Brake longevity itself, I did have the rear brake pads replaced when VeloFix swapped out the first rear wheel. The rear pads were actually pretty much gone at that point. At that point, the bike only had about 650 miles, somewhere in that area. And then later, at around Thanksgiving time over 2019, I did have the front brake pads replaced, and that was just under 1,000 miles at that point in time. The brakes have been on since then. They feel okay, but I'm starting to get a little bit of grinding noise, so I did order a new set of pads off Amazon. I ordered the actual Tektro Aries pads, and I'm going to throw those in here in the next week or so. The other thing I wanted to mention, back in Thanksgiving of this past year when I had the front brake pads replaced, VeloFix came out here to do that and actually had them just look back at the bike, adjust everything, and that was at the time when Rad wanted to have them confirm the grinding noise from the second wheel, which they did. When VeloFix was out, they did note that my chain had stretched, and at that time, as mentioned before, I had about 1,000 miles on the bike when around Thanksgiving time, and I was just kind of surprised that the chain had stretched after that amount of time and only about 6 months of use. I did have them replace it. It was fairly nominal as far as cost goes. I think it was about $30 or $35 to have them put a new chain on, so I just had them do it at that time. One other little annoying thing too is that the cover for the charging port on the battery had torn after about 8 months of use. I did talk to Rad. They sent me out a new one to get it replaced. And the second one, after about 2 weeks of use, has actually started to tear right on the little nub that holds it together too. I am pretty careful as far as when I unplug it to plug in the charging port and then plug everything back in. I always charge it myself, and it just seems to be a weak link. Just being very careful as far as pulling it in, pulling it out. Again, I do ride in the rain, so I want to make sure I have that in there to cover up the charge port. But again, that's more or less a little annoyance rather than necessarily a manufacturer's defect. Last thing I wanted to talk about as far as a con is the tires in general. The knobby tires, the rear tire, I did end up replacing to one of the step-through slicks that comes on the step-through RadMini, and I put that on there about 300 or 400 miles ago. The rear tire itself, the knobby, the original tire that was on there, had worn down a fair amount in the center throughout about 1,700 miles of use. I'll show a little picture as far as what the rear tire looks like at this point, as far as the front tire, and what a brand new tire looks like too. I normally ran the knobbies around 23 to 24 psi. Maximum was 30 psi as far as what's listed on the tire from the manual. And Again, I only ride on paved streets, so I'm sure that plays a factor into it, and then also being a little bit heavier as far as the weight spectrum goes, and having the bike not be so balanced weight-wise. A lot of the weight is in the rear of the bike, so I'm sure that's why the rear tire gets taken a lot more of the forces versus the front tire. So again, as far as the rear tire, I would have expected a little bit better wear on it, but again, riding purely on paved streets, I'm sure that plays a fair amount as far as the wear that goes on the rear tire itself. The front tire, I'll definitely be able to get another season out of it. At this point, I have slicks for the summertime, the slicks that come on the step through. They're called the Craze, and then the knobbies are called the Crusades, made by Kenda. So I will run the slicks throughout the summertime and wait until October, November of this upcoming year to switch back to the knobbies for the wintertime. Fortunately, when I've gotten the new wheels from Rad, the warranty replacement wheels, they came fully loaded, meaning it's a new tire, a new tube, a new cassette, a new brake rotor, everything's brand new on that rear wheel. It just comes as a complete package. So every time they've sent me a new rear wheel, I've gotten a new tire and a new tube and everything. So one of the wheels they sent me actually came with one of the slick tires, and one of the other ones they sent me came with a new knobby tire. So I had one of the slicks that I didn't have to pay for, and I have a brand new knobby that I have to pay for, so I bought one of the other slicks for the front, so I have matching tires for the summertime. With the slicks themselves, I will note that in the rain, any sort of wet weather, not even necessarily actually rain, just wet pavement, they're definitely a lot slipperier than the knobby tires themselves. I've ridden a lot in the rain with the knobby tires, never had any sort of kind of traction issues, but going into corners, if I don't slow down enough with the slicks, I definitely had a couple times where I've slid out, never actually gone down fortunately, but I definitely have had the bike come out a little bit, so now I just take a little more time, a little more precaution when going around the turns whenever there's sort of wet pavement. I plan on doing another video also to really go into depth as far as my personal experience with the slick tires, the Crazes, versus the knobbies, the Crusades. So I will end up having one of those videos coming up soon in the next couple weeks as far as putting that together too. Well, that's about it for now. That's more or less my update over just having the bike over a little to over 2,000 miles. Again, the bike itself in general has performed really well. Been pretty happy with it. I do eventually plan on getting something a little nicer as far as a little less weight and component wise. I've been looking at the Turn GSDs. Haven't really made a decision on that yet, but so far this bike's been okay. I'm going to use it throughout the summer and getting through the current events we're going through right now before spending any more money, but I think at some point in time I'll end up replacing this bike with something a little bit nicer. Again, as far as this being an entry-level bike, it's a great bike. I use it day in and day out. It has performed reliability-wise as far as the electronics has been wonderful. It's been a very good bike overall. Well, that's about it for now. Thanks you guys again for coming over and watching this video. As I have any other issues or performance, reliability, things like that come along the way, I will update and put further videos up. But so far, again, been pretty happy with the bike. I give it a solid 7.5 or 8 out of 10 as far as being a really reliable bike for daily commuting. If you guys happen to like this video, please hit the like button. Please subscribe if you like review videos in general, and I will see you in the next one.